In today's video, I'll show you how to make Anna's travel outfit from Frozen 2. All materials and amounts will be listed in the blog post linked in the description down below. But before we get started, hit that subscribe button for more cosplay and costume making tutorials. To start, I took a simple cotton fabric and draped the pattern on my dress form. You'll want to add her signature square neckline and room for a zipper in the back. I also opted for a princess seam along the front for shaping. Once you have your pattern draped and style lines marked, cut the pattern apart and transfer it to some paper and add seam allowance. Make sure to add extra seam allowance in the back for the zipper. Once you have your bodice pattern pieces with allowances added and cut out, place them on your fabric and cut them out. I also used a basic straight sleeve pattern and cut 4 pieces, one for each side of the arm. Now assemble the bodice and leave the sleeves off and set it aside. For the skirt, I took my waist measurement and divided it into 2. For the back half, I divided it into 2 again and used an A-line skirt pattern shape that was about 26 inches long. However, the length will depend on your height and preference. Dividing it by 2 is important so we can put a zipper in the back. Also, add extra allowance along that seam and standard allowance along the other sides. For the front, I divided the front half of my waist by thirds, 2/3 for one side and 1/3 for the other. And I created another A-line shape at the same length. This will give us the side slit we want. Add seam allowance and cut it out from both your gold lining fabric and the black outer fabric. Sew all the panels together, then serge or sew the lining to the outer fabric wrong sides together. Make sure to baste the top edge of the zipper seams so you can set in the zipper later and remove the stitching easily. Now we need to bind the slit and bottom edges in bias tape from the same gold fabric. To make bias tape, find the selvage of your fabric and cut a clean straight line up from the selvage at a right angle. Now measure up the selvage and raw edge the same distance. I usually start about 14 inches up to get a good bit of length. Connect the 2 lines to create a 45-degree angled line. Then measure another line up as wide as you want your tape to be. I want my final tape width to be 1/2 inch, so I need to multiply that by 4. Therefore, my tape needs to be 2 inches wide. Mark more strips than you think you need and cut them out. Apply the binding to the edges of the slit and hem, as well as around the neck of the bodice. To sew it, you can follow my corset binding tutorial linked in the cards above. Once the binding was applied, I sewed the waist of the skirt to the waist of the shirt, making sure the slit edges are side by side at the front, and then installed the zipper. From there, we're going to make the sleeves. Cut some 2-inch strips of mustard stretch fabric, long enough to go the length of the sleeve, with the stretch running the width of the strip. Then serge and stitch these between the 2 sides of the sleeve. Then measure how tall you want the cuff to be and mark it with a safety pin on both sleeves. For the cuff, we're going to cut a rectangular piece of black fabric as wide as your cuff height and as long as the sleeve wrist circumference, plus some seam allowance. Stitch your trim in the very center, apply bias tape to the top and bottom, and sew up the seam. Go back and measure the sleeve from your top of the cuff marking to the sleeve cap, and divide that measurement by how many buttons you want to place on the sleeve. Mark these down the center of the gold strip with pins. Then, cut more 2-inch wide strips of the gold fabric. You can serge the edges or cut them wider and turn them into tubes for a cleaner look. Mark the same measurements on the strips as we did on the sleeve. With a needle and thread, gather across the strip at each of these markings. Once complete, apply the gathered trim to the sleeve, matching up the gathers with our pins. You can sew these down and attach the buttons separate or all in one. Now to add the cuff. What I should have done was conceal the sleeve edge in the bottom of the bias binding of the cuff, But instead I just finished the sleeve with a tight serging and hand stitched the cuff to the sleeve. Once complete, set the sleeve into the shoulder of the bodice. Next I found the center of the chest of the bodice to recreate her appliques. I didn't have time to embroider her leaves by hand, nor own a machine to do so I used a bunch of swirl appliques in gold, cutting and arranging till I found something I liked. I should note that not all golds are the same, especially with appliques, so I painted them all the same with acrylic paint and textile medium. I should have swapped the position of the two center appliques and put the brooch on the undershirt where it is in the film, but I'm gonna remake this costume later with better materials. Once I had the design I liked, I whip stitch basted it in place and then cemented it with a sewing machine. Now let's make the belt. If the fabric you choose is not very stiff, you may want to iron some interfacing in it to stiffen it, but I used upholstery grade brushed cotton so it was heavy enough. The pattern is simply a rectangle as long as your waist circumference. However, one side is about 6.5 inches tall and the other end is about 4.5 inches tall. Again, these measurements may change depending on your stature. Simply mark the height on each ends of the rectangle and connect the two lines with a yardstick. Then cut out 2 layers. You'll want to cut some 5-inch wide strips that are double your waist measurement in length. They do not have to be on the bias though. Sew these into tubes and turn them right side out and iron them. These will make our ties for the belt. Next, place one large belt piece right side up on the table. Pin the ties we just made at the center of the two ends of the belt and neatly fold the tails inward. Place the other large belt piece right side down and pin everything together. Sew around the large belt, keeping the ties inside and away from the stitching except for where they're pinned on the ends of the belt. But leave at least 4 inches open at the bottom of the belt where we'll pull everything right side out. Trim the corners as shown, taking care not to cut into the stitching. Then unpin the ties from inside, pulling the ties to flip the belt right side out. Use a pointed object like a pencil or point turner to push the corners out, but be careful not to rip the stitching. Give the whole thing an iron and then hand sew the hole closed. Next, try it on as shown and mark where the underside tie meets the waistline at the side and mark it. It should be in the center of the belt. Using your buttonhole setting or a tight zigzag stitch, make a buttonhole as tall as the tie is wide so it may slip through. Try it on and trim the ties if you need.
It's Gail!
Lastly, let's make the undershirt. I used a mustard lycra and draped tank top shirt with a tight collar on my dress form. I serged all the seams together and put it back on the mannequin. Then I used some muslin to drape a mandarin collar pattern. I cut 2 pieces of lycra for the collar. Unfortunately, I didn't have it on hand nor time to buy some interfacing for the collar, but it should be interfaced so it stands up on its own. I also forgot to split the collar and back piece into 2 and add seam allowance so I could put in a zipper cleanly. However, I was able to top stitch a zipper in and simply cut the fabric, and since it is a knit, it won't fray. Once the collar was sewn to the shirt, I found some black braid trim in my stash and hand sewed it around the collar. If you're thinking of using this trim, just don't. It always falls apart and ain't nobody got time to sew each and every loop down. That being said, I added more decorative trim to the center front, using a lighter to seal the edges. I took this brooch style button that looked kinda cheap and sanded it down to give it a much nicer looking paint job. I used black acrylic paint and gold rub and buff. I also brushed that trash trim with the gold rub and buff in an attempt to make it look not so trashy. Now the brooch should be sewn to the shirt, but I put it in the center of the dress. Lastly, I paired it with some mustard high-waisted trousers from Pinup Girl Clothing, but they got too small for me, so I used some Vixen by Michelin Pitt twill trousers in black, which looked just as fine, as well as some black leather knee-high boots from the thrift store. I love the look of this costume, but as I said earlier, I didn't think I would like it, so I definitely want to remake it here soon with better materials. Check out my blog linked below to see what changes I plan to make, and let me know if you want to see the remake video. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll all be notified when I release the tutorial for Elsa's ending spirit dress, coming soon! If you found this video helpful, share it with your friends. It helps me to be able to bring more costume making tutorials to you. And lastly, remember, cosplay is all about having fun. And wash your hands. Bye guys.